Hello and welcome. In today's video, we're going to see how we can load multiple models into a single report using Vcad. In particular, we will be loading data from a Navisworks file and from several DWG files. Finally, we will see how we can connect the data from these different types of files to create a dashboard showing multiple models at the same time. So for starters, I've gone ahead and downloaded one of our pre-made templates for my Navisworks model. We can have a quick look over here. You can see this is an MEP model, so I'll have data from my electrical, HVAC, and plumbing systems all loaded up in this Navisworks model. Now what I want to do is I also want to load data from the same project, but coming from some DWG files that I have. In particular, we can see I have these loaded up in my project folder. So I want to be able to quickly and dynamically load different reports, different sheets from the different files. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the information, the Vcad references for these different drawings and load them up into Power BI. Now I could just go ahead and add the data for each one of these, but I want to do something a little more dynamic. So our objective is to have a table that has the name of each file, and then from the templates download window, I'm also going to get the view name and the slot ID for each one of these. Once I have those in a file, I can return to my Power BI dashboard. So let's go ahead and let's go to transform data, and we're going to add that DWG information. So let's collapse a few of these, make a little room, and let's add a new group for some order. Call this DWG data. And now here I want to load a new source. I'm going to use a CSV file. You can see I have it here loaded up in my assets folder. I have a sheets.csv. So let's have a look at what this is. So when we open it up, you can see this is simply 3 columns: slot ID, file name, and view name. So those 3 bits of information that I was talking about before. So let's go ahead and load these up. And I'm going to add another step to use the first row as headers. And there we go. So we have our our 4 drawings here. So level 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for each one, slot ID and different views. Now what I want to do is I want to load the data for each one of these. I want to do this dynamically, and I want to do this all together. So my objective is to have a single table with the information for all of my drawings, but also knowing which slots they are related to. So what I can do is I can reuse some of the code that is already inside of the template. So in particular, without going into too much detail, the Vcad funcget file, all it does is it takes a file name and it makes an HTTP call to the Vcad APIs and downloads data for a specific file. So we're going to reuse a lot of this. So let's go ahead and duplicate this. We're going to move this down to my DWG file. And we'll just leave this as Vcad funcget file 2 for now. Let's go ahead and have a look at the code. So I'm going to go to the advanced editor. And here we can see I have a single input, which is the file name. And then we're using a lot of parameters and data sets from my different queries. Now what I would like is to be able to dynamically pass in the GUID file or the slot ID. And I can do that by simply adding here another parameter. So I'm going to do slot ID over here. And then I'm going to replace it inside of my function. Same goes for the file name. Well, the file name is already dynamic, so that's fine. But same goes for the view. So over here, we're going to add the view name and replace it in the function. Okay, and for now, we are done with the changes. So we can go ahead and press OK. Now we can see the function preview changes a little because it now has 3 parameters. Now let's get back to our sheets. Now what I want to do is for each one of these sheets, I actually want to load 2 different data sets. I want the properties and the assets. Kind of like we have over here, assets parquet and properties parquet. And if we go and see, for example, assets, so here first step, what is happening is it's calling Vcad funcGetFile, that function we started out with, and it's passing in the dataset name, assets.parquet. So we're going to need this bit of information. And of course, same goes for properties parquet. We can see we have the opposite. So to do this, all we need is to make sure that in my sheets table, I actually have for each sheet 2 rows, one for the assets and one for the properties. We can do that very simply. Let's just add a custom column. We'll call this dataset. And here we're going to return a list which will contain assets.parquet. And then with quotations, properties.parquet. Close the list, and we are good to go. You can see here I have the values. Now let's expand this, adding new rows. And we can see now it used to be 4 rows, it's now of course 8, and we have the different values. Now we can actually call that function that we wanted to call, because we have everything. We have the dataset name, we have the slot ID, and the view name. So let's go ahead and under add column, invoke custom function is what I want to do. So let me close this out. Invoke custom function. Here we are going to call this, for now, simply data. And we're going to call our Vcad funcGetFile2. Now these are all going to be using data from our dataset. So file name, this is the name of the dataset we want to use. So it'll be dataset. This last column we just added. Slot ID will of course be slot ID. And view name will of course be view name. Let's go ahead and confirm. And now we can see for each one of these, we have the actual dataset with all the data for our DWG file. Great. Now let's go ahead and let's create our actual DWG assets and DWG properties tables. So to do that, I'm going to create a reference to my sheets, which I'm going to call DWG assets. So for now here, we're going to focus on assets. So of course, first step is to actually filter based on assets. And then here, what I want to do, and we could have done this differently. I could have added the dataset name here and called the function here, but it's the same. I just want you to get an idea of how we could do this dynamically. So we can go ahead and remove this column. And I'm going to expand my data. Let's not add any prefixes. There we go. And so now I have this crazy table, which is simply, this is exactly the same data that I would have in assets parquet at the first step. Now you'll notice that in assets parquet, we actually have a few steps. I don't want to get into what these do for now. We're simply going to reapply these same steps. To do that, I'm going to right click and do advanced editor. And don't get scared if you're not familiar with the advanced editor. All we're going to be doing here is simply copy all of this code. And then we're going to go back to our DWG assets. Here, I want to go to advanced editor. And I basically want to remove these last 2 rows where it says in and paste in the code I just got. Now we can remove this let. And of course, the source in my original case was the call to the function. But basically, the steps we did here is the equivalent of calling the function. So we can remove this as well. We can add a comma. And then importantly, I want to get, let's keep this separate. I want to get the name of the previous step and replace it over here where it says source. So now I'm basically continuing the chain of steps with all the operations that I would have done in assets parquet. Let's go ahead and click done. You can see I have the table, and this table has the same identical structure that assets parquet has, with of course the exception of these additional columns at the beginning. So slot ID, file name, view name. Okay, great. But we're not done yet. So another thing that happens in the standard template is that then is this Vcad assets query. Now, this also has a series of steps, and if we see the first step is actually assets parquet. So this is basically taking off where assets parquet leaves us. So let's repeat what we just did. So I'm just going to advanced editor, copy everything, and go to DWG assets, advanced editor, and here I'm going to be pasting in, removing of course the in and the last call. Just as before, remove the let and this first data set, because this is essentially everything that happened before. So let's remove these two. Here I want to add a comma at the end of the last step, and I'm going to copy the step name and replace it here with source. There we go. You might get an issue with names being repeated. So for example, we can see here that the variable name remove columns has already been used in this function. Not a problem. All we need to do is here make sure that this is renamed to something that is unique. So for now, we'll just call it remove columns 2. And very important, I also need all the code following that used to call remove columns now needs to call remove columns 2. So specifically right here. Otherwise, the function will not work. There we go. Now if we press OK, we can see that another bit of transformation has been done, and this is exactly the same structure that we have in Vcad assets, of course, except for those previous columns that we talked about before. Great. Now let's repeat everything, but for the properties dataset. So I'm going to go a little faster here. So all I want to do is create a reference. I'm going to rename this to DWG properties. Again, filter for the data set that I want, so properties in this case. I'm going to remove this column. I'm going to extend the data table. Here we have it. So basically we've done the equivalent of calling the function. And now we're going to go back to properties parquet, right click, advanced editor, copy all the code. Go back to DWG properties, advanced editor, remove last in, and paste in all the code, comma to keep the chain going, remove the very beginning, and use the correct step name. There we go. Done. So now we basically did everything in properties parquet. Of course, same identical structure. Vcad properties starts from properties.parquet. And we can see here not much changes. There's just one step where the columns get assigned a specific type. But to be consistent, let's again apply these steps. So let's go ahead and advanced editor, copy all the code, close it out, Vcad properties, advanced editor, remove the last in, paste, remember to add the comma, and remove the first two. Finally, copy the last step's name and replace source. There we go. I hope I didn't go too fast. If needed, you can always pause or go back. But the operations are exactly what we saw before with the assets. Okay, great. So now we have these crazy tables with all the data, both assets and properties, for all the items of all my DWG files. And we could basically stop here, but there's one important step that we still need to do, which is actually being able to connect the two. Because of course, let me actually show you. So if I go ahead and apply this, and let's see that there aren't any errors. I don't expect any, but let's check. Perfect. Now, if we return to the actual dashboard, and we go to the data sets, to the relationships. So here I have my two new queries, so DWG assets and DWG properties. Let's move these around a bit. Okay, now if I wanted to create a relationship between these two, I have a bit of an issue, and we can see it very clearly, because normally what I would do is I would connect them based on the object ID. But if I do that, I can see that I'm getting presented with a many-to-many connection. This is because, of course, object IDs are no longer unique because different files can have the same object ID. In fact, if I go over to Assets and I select the object ID column, I can see I have 9,586 rows, but only 4,809 distinct values. So what I need to do, well, let's see if we can find a good example here. So if I select one, there, object ID 1001, we can see is in 3 different files, level 5, 4, and 3. So I need a way for these to be unique. I need a unique key. So let's go ahead and create that. Let's clear this filter. And let's go back to the Power Query editor. Once I'm in here, what I can do is I can take my DWG assets, and I basically want to create a new column that has both the slot ID and the object ID. So to do that, I can go to Add Column. I'm going to do a custom column, and I'm going to call this Unique Key. Unique Key. And this will simply be my slot, and let's put a separator, so it'll be the underscore, and I want the object ID. Now, one important thing to remember is object ID is actually a number. So I want to cast this. So I want to do number.toText of my object ID. That way I'm sure that this will be a text, and it'll be able to concatenate everything. Let's go ahead and press OK. And there we go. We have our unique key. Now let's open up the editor again, copy all this code, and we're going to do exactly the same thing for the DWG properties table. So let's go over here and then custom column. We'll call this unique key and paste in the formula. Same formula, the columns are named exactly the same, so we're good to go. Now we can actually create that relationship. So once again, let's apply these changes. And then we can move on back to the relationships. Oh, and we can see Power BI already made the relationship for us. Now let's change it a moment. I want this to be bidirectional. So to do that, I'm simply going to select it and then cross-filter direction, both apply. There we go. That way we can also filter the assets based on the properties. Okay, great. So now we have our DWG data. So let's have a look at how we can render these files in our report. So if we go over to the report view, what I can do is I can actually copy or let's duplicate this this report page. So I'm just going to duplicate this. I'm going to clear out a bunch of things that I don't need. So all this top bar we can remove, and all these items. Maybe keep this one. And we can remove. Well, let's keep this too. There we go. So right now we're showing the Navisworks model, and the way this is being selected is if we go over to the formatting options, we can see under model data, file ID is being fed through a function. If we edit this, we can see it's simply pulling the first Vcad GeoID file. This is how regular Vcad templates function. The file reference is centralized, so it's easy to replace. So let's do that. Let's replace it. Now in this case, instead of using a static parameter, I want to load from a table. So what I want is I want to get from a DWG assets table, I want to load the slot ID. Press OK, and this will already start doing something. You can see we already have our DWG file. Of course, the item count didn't change. This is due to two things. So number one, the other thing we need to change is if we go to Forge Options, we want to change the reference to the view. So again, this is a function. Exactly like before, we're going to select from DWG asset and then say, pass it the view name. Okay, great. Great, and then finally go back to the data bindings, and here we're using the object ID coming from Vcad assets. This is the Navisworks data. So what I want to do is I want to pull the object ID from DWG assets. There we go. We can remove the old one. And now the correct drawing will be loaded. And we can see the item count is more like what we're expecting. Okay, let's update some of the other visuals. So here, instead of this file name, I want to pull my file name from a DWG file. And importantly, I only want to load one at a time. So to do that, I'm going to go to the options, slicer settings, section selection, and single select. There we go. So now if I switch, you can see the viewer loads in the different DWG file, and we're passing in only the objects from that sheet. Down here, we can change a little of the data real quick. So let's add the file name over here and count the correct object IDs. Of course, this will always be a single one, but we can get a count of the objects. Okay, great. So we have multiple drawings and models loaded up into the report dynamically. We can easily switch between them. We could do the same mechanism with views or completely different file types. Now, the last bit that we want to do is we want to match the data from the Navisworks model and the data from the DWG files. Now, to do that, we're going to need some sort of connection. This will vary depending on your project. In my case, I have a simple CSV table that maps handles from the DWG files with IFC GUIDs coming from the Navisworks model. So let's go ahead and load that in, and let's see what we need to do to use it. So to load it in, we can just do it from here. I can do get data, and I'm going to load a text CSV. You can see here I have my IFC GUID handle mapping. Let's open that up. And again, very simple table. Let's load it and let's go over to Power Query to edit it. Here we have it. So we can see here, again, we need to tell it to use the first row as a header. Okay, and now we can see for each one we have the GUID for the 3D object, the handle for the 2D representation, and we also have the information of the level they're connected to. This can be useful then if we want to be able to filter based on a specific level. For now, we need to find a way to connect these to our data sets. So let's start from the Navisworks data. So here I have IFC GUIDs. I want to connect this to the Vcad asset table, but of course the Vcad asset table doesn't have that GUID data here. But I can generate a query that has that data. To do that, this will be very simple. I'm just going to go ahead and create a reference to the Vcad properties table. I'm going to call this IFC GUIDs. And then I want to filter the property name. So of all of them, I am of course looking for IFC GUID. Notice that for each object, I actually have multiple rows. This is not okay. So what I want is the element, not the Revit link instance. So let's go ahead and filter also the section for element. There we go. And so here we can see now they are unique for each object. Great. So now I have these GUIDs. I want them back into the Vcad assets table. So let's select Vcad assets, home, merge queries, and we're going to merge our IFC GUIDs. Here we can use the object ID because the object ID is unique, of course, because I have a single Navisworks model. So let's go ahead and merge these two. Now, not every Navisworks object will have an IFC GUID, but it doesn't matter. The ones that have it are the ones that we're interested in. And out of this, I just simply need to load the value. I could have probably done some more formatting on this table if I was going to use it for a large-scale project, but for our purposes right now, simply pulling up the value. Here I'm going to rename it to IFC GUID. There we go. Okay, so now I have a connection between that data and my IFC handle mapping. I need to do the same thing from the DWG side. So just like we did with Navisworks, we're going to start from the properties, create a reference, and this will be my DWG handles. Now, of all the properties, I only want the handles. In this case, the type is unique, so we don't have to worry about filtering based on section. And so here we have our handles. Now, in this case, object IDs are not unique. So when I go back to DWG assets and I merge, I'm going to be using our unique key. DWG asset, handles and unique key. There we go. You can see each one of these actually has the correct handle in this case. Again, expand, we only want the value. And we can rename this to handle. There we go. Okay, now we actually have all the data that we need. So we can go ahead and apply. This may take a moment because we are also parsing all the data from the Navisworks model, so it'll take a little longer than the previous data transformations. But once everything is done, we can go ahead and proceed with the creation of the relationships between the data from our Navisworks model to the various DWG models. So let's go back to the report and model view. We can see here we have our new tables. We don't actually need them, so let's just set these aside for now. What we want is the connection table, IFC GUID handle mapping. Okay, and this we're going to connect using the handle. For the DWG side. And we are going to use the IFC GUID, of course, for the Navisworks, so for the 3D side of things. And there we have it. So now, if we go to our report, what we could do is we could just, let's shrink this a little and move this along. There we go, better. Let's remove him and load from model info. I'm just going to copy the viewer. Select a visual, that way I can control V to paste. There we have it. Let's do a bit of resizing. Okay, great. Now, you can see already mapping has happened. So if I can see I have only the heat recovery units selected in both the 3D view and the 2D view as well. And I can switch between the different floors if I want. Actually, instead of using this data, let's go ahead and use the information from our mapping. And here I can add the level rather than the file name. There we go. So level 2, and I can then switch to level 3. And the correct models are selected. And the other nice thing is, let's do a little formatting here. Just add a base theme. I'll do this really quick, just so that we can get a little more visibility. Make it a little darker. There we go. Okay, so Now, if I make selections in one of these, those will be reflected in the other model as well. So I can pop around in the 2D space if I want and have that reflected in the 3D space, or vice versa. Let's undo the selections. If I start in the 3D space, I can have those reflected on the right. And then of course I can also choose to switch between levels, however I prefer. Okay, so this has been a very basic and quick implementation of rendering multiple models and drawings dynamically based on selections made in my report. All of this possible thanks to Vcad's datasets and rendering. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for future examples on these sort of topics.